The woman who said nothing. There is a room somewhere in the federal district of Washington, D.C. that has no windows. The walls are the color of old concrete. The table is government-issue gray, bolted to the floor, the kind of furniture designed to outlast the conversations held around it. A fluorescent light hums overhead with the patience of something that has never needed sleep. A man sits on one side of that table. He wears a charcoal suit that was expensive when he bought it 3 years ago. He has the hands of someone who carries briefcases, not weapons. In front of him is a file folder thick as a brick, bound with a red security band that most people in the United States government will never see in their careers. He opens it slowly, the way you open something you are not entirely sure you want to read. Across from him, a woman sits with her hands resting flat on the table. She is 32 years old, average height, lean in the way that distance runners are lean, not gym lean, but lean the way the body becomes when it has spent years burning everything that is not necessary. Her hair is pulled back. Her eyes are gray. Not gray like storm clouds, not gray like anything poetic, just gray, flat and calm, and taking in everything at once. The man looks up from the file. He says, "You were at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado on the 14th. Can you explain what you were doing there?" She looks at him without blinking. She says, "I was sent there." He waits for more. She does not give him more. He asks, "By whom?" The fluorescent light hums. She says nothing. That's silence. That specific, deliberate, absolute silence. It is not the silence of someone who does not know the answer. It is not the silence of fear or confusion. It is the silence of someone who has learned over the course of a life you cannot read on her face that words are tools and tools should only be used when the job requires them. The man looks back down at the file. He turns a page, then another. His expression changes in a way he clearly does not intend. Something shifts behind his eyes, some small recalibration, the way a man looks when he realizes the map he has been using does not match the terrain in front of him. He closes the folder. He does not ask another question for a long moment. Outside that windowless room, somewhere across the country on a stretch of California coastline, where the land narrows to almost nothing between the ocean and the bay, where everything is salt air and open sky, and the profound indifference of geography to human significance, there is a gymnasium. It smells of rubber and disinfectant and the kind of effort that soaks into walls and never fully leaves. There is a blue mat on the floor worn smooth in the middle from 10,000 training hours. And on that mat, several weeks before the man in the charcoal suit opened his folder, something happened that no one in that gymnasium would ever entirely forget. This is that story. Part 1, the room that did not see her. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, San Diego, California, September 2019. The base sits at the edge of the Coronado Peninsula, where the Silver Strand narrows to a thin strip of land between the Pacific and San Diego Bay. The base does not advertise what happens inside it. There are no signs explaining its purpose to the cars passing on the road outside. There does not need to be. The people who know what happens at Coronado know because they earned the right to know. Everyone else keeps driving. Inside the main training complex in a gymnasium that takes up most of the north end of the building, 43 sailors stood in a loose formation on a Tuesday morning at 0730. They ranged in age from 19 to 28. Most had been in the Navy for less than 18 months. Some had never been deployed. They stood in the slightly uncertain way that young people stand when they are still learning the physical language of institutional authority, still working out how to hold their bodies in a room where rank determines everything. The air in the gymnasium was the stale warmth of a closed space that has been absorbing effort since early morning. The lights were on full. The rubber mat caught and held them with the flat, even glow of a surface designed for function rather than comfort. The sailors waited. At the far end of the mat, near the equipment lockers, a woman sat on a metal folding chair. She was filling out paperwork, not looking up, not watching the room. She had a pen in her right hand and a clipboard on her knee, and she moved through the forms with the unhurried focus of someone completing a routine administrative task. Her uniform was worn at the edges, not frayed, not violated, but lived in the way fabric looks after years of actual use rather than ceremonial wear. She was of average height and average build. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes, when she occasionally raised them to check a figure on a secondary form, were gray and flat and seemed to be attending to the paperwork rather than to any of the people around her. No one introduced her when they came in. No one looked at her long enough to think they should. Along the far wall near the equipment lockers, an older sailor sat on a bench. He looked like any number of career enlisted men who cycle through training facilities, Men who have been in long enough that their presence in a room requires no explanation and therefore receives none. He had a battered canvas bag at his feet. He sat with his hands loose on his knees and watched the room with the unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be and no particular investment in what happens next. He was the second person the Naval Inspector General's office had sent to Coronado. His job was to document the evaluation. Her job was to conduct it. She had known he was there since day one. He had known she knew. Neither of them had acknowledged it once. That is how the work is done. Before going further, there is something worth understanding about what that base represented in September of 2019 and what that moment in history felt like for the men and women who served in it. It had been 3 years since the Department of Defense formally opened all combat positions to women. 3 years since a directive came down from Washington that had been depending on who you asked, either a long overdue correction to an unjust system or an unwelcome imposition of politics onto an institution that ran on different rules than the rest of civilian life. The argument was not new. It had been running in one form or another for decades. In 1994, the first women were permitted to serve aboard combat ships. Many of you remember that, many of you had opinions about it then, and some of you still have those opinions now. It was a different era in some ways and not so different in others. The debates in Congress sounded like the debates that always happen when an institution built for one group of people is required to make room for another. Some people argued standards, some argued tradition, some argued about what the research said. The institution as institutions do move slowly with great reluctance and with the stubbornness of something that has been doing things one way for a very long time. By 2019, the policy had been settled at the top. But policy and culture are two different things. You can change the rules of a place in an afternoon. Changing what the place actually believes takes longer. Sometimes much longer. And sometimes in certain quarters of certain institutions, the gap between the written rule and the lived reality is wide enough to swallow people whole. That gap is what brought Nora Calloway to that gymnasium, though no one in that room knew it yet. The door at the far end of the gym opened at 07:35, and Lieutenant Commander Brett Harwick walked in. He was 44 years old, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have never once doubted that the room belonged to them. It was not arrogance in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and in some ways more dangerous. It was the complete and settled conviction of a man who has lived inside a certain story about himself for so long that the story has become indistinguishable from fact. He was broad through the shoulders, a little thicker at the middle than he had been 10 years ago, but still physically imposing in the way that matters in institutional settings, which is to say he took up space confidently and did not apologize for it. His uniform was immaculate, pressed hard, creased, sharp, every element in its correct position. He wore his rank the way some men wear an argument they have already decided they have won. His father had been Master Sergeant Wallace Harwick, a man who received a Bronze Star at a place called Kafji during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The story of that morning of what Wallace Harwick did and why, and at what cost, was the kind of story that becomes family mythology. It gets told at holidays. It gets told to children, then to grandchildren. It gets compressed over time from the complicated, terrifying human mess of actual combat into something clean enough to frame and hang on a wall. In Brett Harwick's office, there was a photograph of his father in uniform. It had been there since his first posting. He kept it because that is what you do with a photograph like that. But there were people who had worked with him for years who had noticed that he rarely looked directly at it, that he positioned the frame slightly angled away from his desk chair, that when visitors mentioned it, his response was always brief and moved quickly to something else. The photograph of a man who had done the thing hangs on the wall of the man who never had to. That is not an accusation. It is simply the kind of inheritance that shapes a person in ways they spend decades not fully understanding. Harwick stood at the front of the gymnasium and looked out at his 43 sailors. His gaze moved across the formation with practiced efficiency. Then it stopped. It stopped at the woman sitting on the folding chair at the far end of the mat. He looked at her for a moment. The clipboard, the pen, the form. He said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Petty Officer." "We are starting." She looked up. Those flat gray eyes found him without urgency. She said, "Yes, sir." She set the clipboard aside, capped the pen, and stood. She walked to the edge of the mat and joined the formation. Nobody moved to make room for her specifically. She found a space and stood in it. Her posture was relaxed but balanced, weight distributed evenly, the way a person stands when their body has had the benefit of not being tense for a very long time. Harwick began his introduction. He paced the front of the mat with the cadence of a man who has given this speech many times and has stopped noticing whether it lands. He talked about the nature of the modern battlefield. He talked about the gap between training environments and operational reality. He talked about the physical demands of close quarters combat in the technical language designed to signal mastery. He was not a stupid man. He knew his material. The problem with Brett Harwick was never competence. The problem was the lens through which competence was filtered. And the lens, after enough years of use, becomes invisible to the person wearing it. He stopped pacing. He looked at Calloway. He said, "The modern force has made commitments to inclusion that I respect." At the policy level, he paused just long enough to make the pause do the work he wanted it to do. At the operational level, what I am required to work with is physics. A few sailors in the front row shifted their weight, the uncomfortable shift of people who sense a line approaching and do not want to be standing closest to it when it gets crossed. Harwick moved toward Calloway. He gestured broadly in her direction, not yet rudely, but with the condescension of someone using another person as a visual aid without asking permission. He said smaller average frame, lower average muscle mass. These are not opinions, these are measurements. And on a battlefield, measurements become consequences. My job, the job all of us have in this room, is to make sure consequences do not become casualties. He said it with complete conviction. He believed every word. And here is the thing about Brett Harwick that took some people years to see clearly. His belief was not manufactured for the audience. He genuinely thought he was being responsible. He had looked at the world through this particular lens for so long that the lens had become invisible to him. That does not make what he did next acceptable, but it makes it something other than simple. Calloway stood at the edge of the mat. Her attention was steady and receiving. If Harwick's words were landing on her, there was no surface evidence. She might have been listening to a weather report. She glanced at her watch. It was a small movement. Her left wrist came up a fraction. Her eyes dropped for less than 1 second, and then she was watching Harwick again. The sailors near her probably did not notice. Harwick certainly did not. But if you had been the kind of person who paid attention to what people do when they think no one is measuring them, you might have wondered. Not nervous, not checking the time the way someone checks when they want to leave. Something else entirely. The way a technician checks an instrument reading. Purposeful. Part of a process that had nothing to do with what was being said out loud in that room. Remember that watch. We will come back to it. Harwick positioned Calloway at the center of the mat for a grappling demonstration. He explained the mechanics with correct vocabulary and the deliberate efficiency of someone performing a rehearsed sequence. The sailors watched. Some took notes. And then his grip on her wrist tightened. Not demonstration tight, not instructional tight. Tight in the way of someone who has decided below the level of conscious thought to make a point that the curriculum does not include. A few sailors in the front row saw it. Their eyes moved to each other and moved away again quickly. Whatever the grip cost her did not appear on the surface. Harwick continued his lecture. He talked about dominant framing. He talked about leverage and neutralization. He talked about the window for a successful counter being fractions of a second requiring explosive power. That he said looking directly at Calloway has to be built over years of specific physical conditioning. He was talking about her, to a room full of people, using her body as the evidence for his argument while she stood there and let him. Her breathing was slow and even. She looked to anyone watching from the outside like someone who had decided the situation did not require a response. Like someone who had run a calculation and determined that the cost of engagement was not worth the output. Harwick leaned closer. His voice dropped to the register that people use when they want to appear to be confiding while actually performing. He said, "Someone your size will never generate the force to move someone my size. That is not an opinion. That is physics, and physics does not care about policy." He pushed, not a strike, not yet, just a shove the way you push a door to test whether it is locked. A small assertion of physical mass, an expectation of movement. She did not move, not 1 centimeter. Her feet stayed where they were. Her center of gravity did not shift. She absorbed the force the way a deeply set pylon absorbs the tide, not by resisting it exactly, but by simply being more rooted than the thing pushing against it. It was so complete and so quiet that for a moment Harwick looked almost confused. He recovered in the way of someone who is not accustomed to being surprised and does not want anyone to notice when he is. He said, "Let us go dynamic." He announced that a real attacker does not hold a real attacker moves. He swung his free hand in a slow arc toward her head, stopped at 6 inches from her face. Demonstration. He did it again. Faster. Closer. Her head moved the minimum necessary distance. no wasted motion, no flinch, just a small, precise adjustment. The way a skilled driver corrects a skid with exactly enough input and no more. Harwick's jaw tightened. He could feel the room watching him. He could feel the demonstration sliding in a direction he had not intended. He had brought her to the center of the mat to prove something, and she was standing there breathing slowly with flat gray eyes, making his proof look like an argument he had forgotten how to finish. What happened next was not in the training manual. Harwick's hand swung, and it did not stop. It was not a full strike, not a closed fist, not maximum force. But it was not a demonstration either. His open palm connected with the side of her jaw with a sound that the room heard clearly and that no one in that room would ever forget. A sharp crack, flat and final. For one full second, the gymnasium held its breath. 43 sailors stood completely still. Some had their mouths open. Some had their hands raised in the position of note-taking and had simply stopped. The youngest of them, Seaman Garrett Finch, standing at the back of the formation, 19 years old, 3 months out of boot camp, felt his stomach drop in the way it drops when you witness something that you know immediately and completely was wrong. Not complicated wrong, not gray area wrong, wrong in the old simple sense that most people learn before they are 10 years old and do not forget. Harwick stood with his hands still slightly raised. He was not smiling. But there was something in his posture, some residual confidence, some lingering expectation that the strike would produce the reaction he needed, that she would step back, that she would react, that the room would see finally what he had been trying to show them. Calloway's head had moved the smallest possible amount from the impact. That was all. She was still standing in the same spot, still balanced, still breathing. If there had been a visible change in her face, the sailors watching might have described it later. But there was no visible change. The expression was the same flat, settled attention it had been since she walked into the room. What had changed was something beneath the expression, something that could not be photographed or quoted, something that the human nervous system recognizes without the help of language. The calculation had completed. The situation had crossed a threshold. And the woman who had said almost nothing since she walked into that gym was done waiting for it to resolve itself. What happened in the next 2 seconds would be described, retold, and argued over in the mess halls and barracks of that base for years after. Every person who witnessed it would tell the story differently. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction, and this particular event happened at a speed that the human eye is not fully equipped to process in real time. What they agreed on, every single one of them, was this. It was fast, it was precise, and it was over before most of them understood it had started. The hand that Harwick had used to grip her wrist so confidently a moment before suddenly had nothing to grip. Her palm had rotated in a direction his grip had not accounted for. Her thumb and 2 fingers found a pressure point on his wrist in the exact position it needed to be, and the grip that had felt so dominant a moment ago became irrelevant. Her other hand moved, not a fist, fingers extended rigid. She struck the side of his neck at the brachial plexus origin, the cluster of nerves that, when addressed correctly, sends an immediate and involuntary shutdown signal to the dominant arm. His arm hung, dead weight. He looked at it with an expression of complete incomprehension. Then she was inside his reach. She used her hip as the fulcrum. She turned under his useless arm. And 60 pounds heavier than her, carrying 30 years of physical confidence, Brett Harwick discovered something about physics that he had not covered in his lecture. He was falling, not collapsing, not stumbling, falling in a controlled, managed, directed arc, guided by someone who had done this before in places where the floor was not rubber-coated and the ceiling was open sky. He landed on his back, flat, her knee on his chest, one hand at his wrist, her forearm at his throat. Not choking, containing. He could not move. He could not speak clearly. He could barely draw a full breath. She was kneeling above him with the same flat gray patient attention she had walked into the room with. 2 seconds. The gymnasium was silent in the way that only very large spaces can be silent, that particular acoustic absence that happens when everyone in a room stops breathing at approximately the same time. 43 sailors stared. No one moved. At the back of the room, Seaman Garrett Finch was still holding his pen. He was 19 years old, and he was watching something that the part of his brain responsible for categorizing experiences did not yet have a folder for. He was storing it whole unprocessed, the way you store things when you know you will need them later, but do not yet know for what. On the bench near the equipment lockers, the older sailor had not moved. He watched the 2 figures on the mat with the same unhurried attention he had given the room all morning. His right hand moved to the outer pocket of the canvas bag at his feet. He checked something there by feel rather than sight, and then his hand came back to his knee. He had what he needed. From the doorway at the far end of the gymnasium, a voice cut through the silence. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Specialist, on your feet. The voice belonged to a man who had not been visible a moment before. He stepped out of the shadowed doorway and into the gymnasium light. Fleet Master Chief Gerald Stannard was 57 years old. He walked with the deliberate economy of someone who has spent 30 years learning that speed and haste are not the same thing. His uniform was worn the way hers was worn, lived in used but immaculate. Every ribbon above his pocket told a portion of a story that would take hours to tell correctly. His face was not hard exactly. It was finished. The way a piece of timber looks when it has been exposed to enough weather that it has stopped being affected by weather. He looked at the mat. He looked at the woman rising from it. He looked at the man on the floor making his way slowly and, with visible effort, back to standing. His expression did not change. He said, "Nobody leaves this room." He crossed the gymnasium floor without hurrying. He stopped in front of his aide, a young petty officer who had been standing 2 steps behind him since they arrived. He said, "Pull Specialist Calloway's service record. Full jacket, Tier 1 clearance." The aide looked at the tablet. He looked back at Stannard. He looked at the woman standing at the edge of the mat. He began entering the access codes. The gym waited. Outside, the base moved through its morning the way it always did, trucks, formations, the rhythm of an institution that does not pause for individual moments, no matter what those moments contain. Inside, the tablet beeped softly. Stannard took it. He looked at the screen. For a long moment, he read. His eyes moved across the information with the speed of someone accustomed to processing classified material quickly. And then they slowed, and then they stopped. He read one line, then another. Something in his jaw moved slightly, a small adjustment, the kind that happens when the mind receives information that requires the body to make room for it. He looked up. He looked at the woman standing at the edge of the mat. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is updating a significant amount of prior understanding in real time. Not recalculating. Updating. There is a difference. And this particular update was not a small one. 43 sailors watched him read. And Nora Calloway stood at the edge of the mat. She had not spoken since the aide began entering the access codes. She did not speak now, she simply waited. The most dangerous person in the room, and still as she had been since the moment she walked in and sat down in that folding chair and uncapped her pen, the one that the room had decided without thinking about it not to see. Part 2. What the file did not say. Fleet Master Chief Gerald Stannard held the tablet the way a man holds something he is not entirely sure is real, not with doubt, with weight. The kind of weight that comes not from the physical object, but from what the object contains. He read without expression, which is to say he read with the complete suppression of expression that 30 years of service teaches a man who intends to remain in control of the rooms he walks into. The gymnasium waited. 43 sailors stood in various arrangements of stunned stillness. Brett Harwick stood near the center of the mat. He had gotten himself back to vertical, which had required more visible effort than a man of his rank and self-regard would have preferred. His dominant arm was returning to function slowly. He held himself with a deliberate stiffness that was doing most of the work his confidence had been doing 10 minutes ago. He was watching Stannard read. His expression had the quality of someone doing arithmetic that keeps producing an answer they do not want. Nora Calloway stood at the edge of the mat. Her hands were at her sides. Her weight was exactly where it had been when she walked in that morning. If the last 2 minutes had cost her anything, there was no evidence of it. At the back of the formation, Seaman Garrett Finch was still holding his pen. He had not written anything with it in several minutes. He noticed in the peripheral way that young people notice things they have not yet decided to pay attention to, that the older sailor on the bench near the equipment lockers had not moved, had not reacted, had simply continued to sit with his hands loose on his knees, watching the room with the same unhurried attention he had given it all morning. There was something in that stillness that Finch could not quite name. He filed it alongside everything else from the last 2 minutes in the folder that did not yet have a label. Stannard lowered the tablet. He turned to his aide. He said, "Read it out." The aide was 26 years old and had pulled a significant number of classified personnel files in 14 months of working for Stannard. He had never been asked to read one aloud to a gymnasium full of sailors. He looked at the tablet. He looked at Stannard. Stannard did not repeat himself. The aide began to read. He read the name first. Specialist First Class Nora Calloway, then the unit designation, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The room had been still before. Now it went still in a different way. The kind of stillness that happens when a word lands in a room and changes the acoustics of everything that follows. Most of the sailors in that gymnasium knew the designation the way most Americans knew it, which is to say they knew it from a night in May of 2011 when they had sat in front of their televisions and watched the news cycle process an event that had taken months to plan and 40 minutes to execute in a compound in Pakistan. They knew it as the unit that had done what most people believed could not be done by human beings operating in real time under real conditions with real consequences for failure. Some of the sailors had been children in 2011. Some had been teenagers watching with their parents, absorbing the specific quality of gravity and relief that comes when something vast and unsolvable is suddenly incomprehensibly resolved. A few of the oldest sailors had been adults that night, calling family members trying to find language for what they were watching. Everyone in that room understood what the unit designation meant. The aide kept reading. 7 combat deployments. Locations classified. Theaters classified. Mission sets classified. The words advanced close quarters, combat instructor, came out of his mouth, and several sailors in the front row made the small involuntary movement of people absorbing information that retroactively changes what they have just witnessed. Then master breacher, then covert methods of entry specialist, then tier 1 operator. The aide stopped. Stannard took the tablet back. He looked at the room with the full sweep of a man who is not looking for anything specific but intends to remember everything he sees. Then he looked at Harwick. Harwick had gone very still, the stillness of a man whose arithmetic has just produced a number he does not know how to work with. Stannard said there is one more line. He read it himself, not to the room, to Harwick. He said Specialist Calloway was assigned to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at the formal request of the Naval Inspector General's office. Independent evaluation of training program conduct, following 3 filed complaints that had not been processed through standard channels. The gymnasium was quiet enough to hear the air moving through it. Stannard said, she was not here to learn. He paused. He said, she was here to watch. The small flicker of her wrist that morning, the fraction of a second when her eyes had dropped and come back up. Not nerves, not impatience. A timestamp, a professional marking a data point in a process that had been running since before she sat down in that folding chair and uncapped her pen. The clipboard, the forms, all of it part of a report that was being written from the moment she arrived. Harwick opened his mouth. Stannard looked at him. Harwick closed his mouth. Stannard said, I am not finished. He reached past the aide and opened a second file on the tablet. He turned the screen outward toward Harwick at an angle that allowed Harwick to see the header, but not the full content. He said, do you know what this is? Harwick said nothing. Stannard said, 3 complaints, filed against this training program, filed by sailors under your command over an 8-month period. He paused. They were received, logged, transferred to a holding folder in the base administrative system, and not processed. He turned the tablet slightly. He said the 3rd one was filed 11 weeks ago. He read the name at the bottom of the 3rd document. He said Seaman First Class A. Whitmore. Something happened to Harwick's face when he heard that name. Not a dramatic reaction, not a collapse or visible shock. Something smaller, and because of its smallness, more revealing. A contraction, the involuntary adjustment a person makes when a word touches something they have been careful not to touch. He recognized the name, and Stannard saw that he recognized it. Stannard said, I need the room cleared. Everyone except Lieutenant Commander Harwick and Specialist Calloway. The 43 sailors moved with the coordinated efficiency of a group given a clear directive and no interest in being the last one standing when the door closes. They filed out quickly. A few looked back. The older sailor on the bench near the equipment locker stood as the others began to move. He picked up the battered canvas bag from the floor beside him. He reached into the outer pocket and removed a small, ruggedized recorder, checked the indicator light, and powered it down with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times in many different rooms. He walked to the gymnasium door and stopped. He looked back at the folding chair in the corner. The clipboard, the cap pen resting on the form she had been filling in when the morning began. He said quietly to no one in particular, that is going to be one hell of a report. He walked out. He was the last one through the door before it closed. Seaman Garrett Finch was in the corridor with the others. He leaned against the wall and looked at the closed gymnasium door, and he thought about what he had just witnessed in the way that 19-year-olds think about things that do not yet have a category with the full weight of attention and none of the vocabulary. The older sailor who had been on the bench came through the door and moved through the corridor without stopping without making eye contact with anyone, without the self-conscious quality of a person trying not to be noticed. He simply moved through the space the way someone moves when they have finished one task and have already begun thinking about the next. Finch watched him go. He thought that man knew. He thought that man was there for the same reason she was there. He thought none of this was an accident. He did not know how much of that was correct. He did not know yet that all of it was. Inside the gymnasium, Stannard stood with Harwick and Calloway in the empty room. The mat was still, the fluorescent lights hummed, the folding chair in the corner held the faint impression of recent use. Stannard looked at Harwick for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Your father pulled men out of a burning vehicle in Kuwait." He said it quietly, factually, not as an accusation and not as a tribute, as context. He said, "I knew men who were there that day. Your father was not the largest man in that unit. He was not the strongest. Nobody who was there remembers him as the most physically imposing person on the team." He paused. He said what they remember is that he was already moving before anyone else had decided what to do. Harwick said nothing. He was looking at a point on the mat approximately 4 feet in front of him, the middle distance people look at when the thing they are actually seeing is internal. Stannard said, "What do you think he would say if he were standing here right now?" The gymnasium held the question. Harwick did not answer, but something in his posture changed. The deliberate stiffness that had been holding him together since he got off the mat gave slightly the way a structure gives when the force against it exceeds what the materials can maintain. He did not collapse. But for one moment the performance stopped, and what was underneath it was visible. A man in his 40s standing on a mat where he had just been taken apart, not physically, but categorically, understanding perhaps for the first time with full clarity the distance between the story he had been telling about himself and the thing he had actually been building with his days. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not come with a clean resolution or the transformation that satisfies the requirements of a story meant to have 3 acts and a lesson. It was a man looking at what his choices had made and not looking away. Stannard watched him for a moment. Then he said, "We are going to take a walk, Brett." It was the first time he had used Harwick's first name. He said it the way you use a first name when the relationship has passed beyond the utility of rank. When the thing being addressed is not the officer, but the man. He said, "There are people you need to speak to." He walked toward the gymnasium door. After a moment, Harwick followed. The door closed. Calloway stood alone on the mat. She stood there for a moment in the empty room, and then she did something she had not done since she walked through the gymnasium door that morning. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Not long enough for anyone to see had there been anyone left to see it. Long enough for whatever was below the surface to acknowledge itself before being reordered and put back in its place. Then she opened her eyes. She walked to the folding chair in the corner, picked up the clipboard and the pen, and sat down. She began to write. To understand why Nora Calloway was in that room, you have to go back 4 years. And then you have to go back 2 more. And somewhere in the space between those 2 points, in the gap between what the official record says and what a person actually carries there, it is the real story. In 2015, there was a woman named Dana Whitmore. Dana Whitmore was 27 years old, and she had been working toward a slot in an advanced naval special warfare program for 3 years. 3 years of physical preparation, professional development, accumulated evaluations. She had the scores. She had the fitness assessments. She had the documentation of performance across multiple deployments that read objectively placed her in the upper tier of candidates for that cycle. Her physical fitness evaluation from the Coronado program told a different story. The numbers in that evaluation were low, not borderline low, disqualifyingly low, low in a way that did not match any other documentation in her file, that did not match the observations of any other supervising officer who had worked with her, that did not match, as the people who would eventually review these records put it, the physical reality of the person they described. She was removed from the program. She was transferred to a different assignment, lower classification, reduced operational scope. She had not chosen the assignment. She had not earned it. But she showed up to it every day with the kind of dignity that belongs to people who understand the difference between the situation they are in and the person they are. The evaluation had been conducted under the authority of the training program at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The supervising officer of record was Lieutenant Commander Brett Harwick. In 2017, Dana Whitmore was part of a team deployed to a location that does not appear in the public record. The details of what happened are classified at a level this account cannot reach. What is known from the documents that exist and the people who were there is that 3 members of the team did not come back. Dana Whitmore was one of the 3. Nora Calloway was the team leader. She was the one who had to make the call. In approximately 3 seconds with incomplete information in conditions that no training environment fully replicates, she made the decision that the mission required. She executed it. She came home. She has had to live inside that decision every day since. That is the cost of the kind of work she had done for 7 deployments. Not the physical cost, which is visible in the scar near her thumb, and the older, quieter damage in places that do not show. The cost that does not show is the weight of knowing that the person who stood beside her, who was supposed to be in a different assignment, a better assignment, an assignment she had earned and been removed from, based on numbers that did not match her reality, would not have been in that location at all if the evaluation had reflected what she actually was. That knowledge does not resolve. It does not diminish with time. It becomes part of the structure of a person load-bearing present in every decision, every morning, every room. 2 years after the mission, Nora Calloway submitted a request to be assigned to an evaluation detail covering Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The Naval Inspector General's office had been holding 3 unprocessed complaints from that program for 8 months. They needed someone to go and see what was happening. She could have said no. There were other details. Other assignments. She requested this one. She sat in a metal folding chair with a clipboard on her knee. She filled out her forms. She waited. In the corridor outside the gymnasium, a woman in her early 20s came around the corner and stopped when she saw the group of sailors standing in the hallway. She was in uniform, the posture of someone new enough to still be figuring out how to inhabit it. She looked at the closed gymnasium door, and then at the sailors, and then at Finch, who was closest to her. She said, "Is this the combatives block? I was told to report here for admin processing." Finch said training is on hold. There was an incident. She said an incident. He said yes. She looked at the door again. She said her name. She said she was Seaman A. Whitmore, that she had transfer orders and needed to check in with the training office. Finch looked at her. He had heard that name 20 minutes ago read from a document by a fleet master chief in a gymnasium full of stunned sailors. He was 19 years old and he did not yet have the vocabulary for what it felt like to hear a name in a file and then hear it again from the person it belonged to standing in front of you in a hallway. He said, "Wait here. I will find out who you need to talk to." She nodded. She stood against the wall the way sailors stand when they have been given an instruction and are following it correctly and waiting for the next one. Finch looked at her for a moment. He thought about the file. He thought about the name. He thought about the gymnasium and the woman on the mat and the 2 seconds and the silence that followed them. He thought about the complaint that had waited 11 weeks in an unreviewed queue. He thought about what it meant that this woman had walked around a corner and into this corridor at this particular moment on this particular morning. There are no coincidences in a story like this. There are only causes and their effects arriving in the order they were always going to arrive in, and people either seeing them clearly or looking away. Finch was not going to look away. He said, "I am going to make sure someone who needs to know that you are here finds out immediately." She looked at him, slightly uncertain. She said, "Is something wrong?" He said, "I think something is about to get a lot more right." He went to find someone to tell. Calloway was still writing when the gymnasium door opened again, and Stannard came back in alone. He crossed the floor and stopped in front of her. She looked up from the clipboard. He said, "Seaman A. Whitmore is in the corridor." Calloway set the pen down. She said, "I know." He looked at her, that updating look, the one that kept requiring larger revisions. He said, "You knew she would be here today." She said she has transfer orders dated the 8th. This was her scheduled check-in date. I verified the date before I requested the assignment. Stannard was quiet for a moment. He said, "You planned this from the beginning." She said, "I planned the evaluation from the beginning. The rest was a question of whether the subject of the evaluation would provide sufficient material for a complete report." She said it the way a person describes measurements they have taken, without inflection, without satisfaction. Stannard looked at her for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, barely a reordering of the lines around his mouth, the kind that belongs to a man who has spent 30 years dealing with situations that surprise him and has learned to appreciate competence in any form it arrives. He said, "The audit is going to require your full testimony. This goes above base commander level." She said, "I understand." He said, "And you are going to have to be somewhere less classified than you currently are for the duration of the process." She said, "I understand that as well." He looked at her one more time. He said, "Is there anything you need before we proceed?" She looked at the clipboard. She looked at the pen. She said 10 more minutes to finish the report. He nodded once. He turned and walked back to the gymnasium door. He paused with his hand on it. He said without turning, "For what it is worth, specialist." He stopped. He said, "We should have reviewed those complaints 8 months ago." She said yes. He opened the door and walked out. She picked up the pen and finished the report. Part 3, The Weight of a Salute. The office of the base commander at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado sits at the end of a hallway that most sailors on that base will spend their entire posting never having reason to walk down. It is not a long hallway. The walls hold framed photographs of ships and commanding officers going back several decades. Official portraits of men in dress whites looking at the camera with the expression of people who have been told this photograph will outlast them. Stannard and Harwick walked that hallway at 09:23. A yeoman at the outer desk looked up when they came through the door. She was 24 years old and had been in her position for 7 months and had developed in that time the practiced neutrality of someone who processes significant events at close range and has learned to do so without visible reaction. She looked at Stannard. She looked at Harwick. She picked up the phone on her desk. She said very quietly into the receiver, "He is here." She set the phone down. She said, "Go ahead." Stannard opened the inner office door. Harwick followed. The door closed behind them with the soft, total sound of good weather stripping, making complete contact with a frame. The yeoman sat with her hands in her lap and waited the way people wait in the outer rooms of places where significant things are being decided. The hallway was quiet. 11 minutes passed. The inner office door opened. Harwick came out walking. Not fast, not slow. The walk of a man who has been told something he cannot unhear and has decided the only available response is to keep moving forward until he is somewhere private enough to stop. His face was arranged in the practiced neutrality of a military officer trained to present a composed exterior to institutional spaces. The training was doing its work, but it was working harder than usual. You could see it working the way you can see an engine laboring on a grade it was not designed for. He did not look at the yeoman. He walked through the outer office and into the hallway. His footsteps were even and paced and grew quieter in a straight line toward the end of the corridor. They did not stop or change cadence. They continued until they could not be heard. The yeoman looked at the empty doorway. She would be asked later by various people in various capacities what she had heard from behind that closed door during those 11 minutes. She would tell them truthfully that she had heard almost nothing. Stannard's voice low and continuous for most of the time. Then a period of silence. Then one sentence spoken clearly enough to carry through the door, though she would not repeat it to anyone who asked, because she understood instinctively that some information belongs to the room where it was said. What she would say when pressed was this. It was not a conversation. It was a reckoning. That word, she had not planned it. It came out of her the way accurate language comes out of people who have witnessed something precisely and are trying to describe it precisely. A reckoning. The specific kind that happens when the accumulated weight of choices made over a long period of time is finally placed on a scale and the scale is allowed to do its work. Over the days that followed, as the account of what had happened in the gymnasium and what had followed from it moved through the base in the way these things move quietly and completely, and with gathering momentum, several people would ask the same question. The question was, what exactly was Harwick disciplined for? The answer surprised most of them. It was not the gymnasium, not the strike, not the grab, not the deliberate escalating physical confrontation with a subordinate in a training setting. All of that was documented. All of that was part of the record. But what Stannard had placed on the base commander's desk that morning was not a report about one morning in September. It was a pattern. It was 14 months of fitness evaluation records, cross-referenced against the independent assessments filed by other supervisors and commanding officers showing a systematic divergence between numbers attributed to female sailors in Harwick's program and numbers attributed to every other evaluation instrument in their service history. Not one evaluation. Not two. 4 confirmed cases in which the specific figures entered by Harwick's program did not reflect the documented physical performance of the sailors in question. 4 cases, 14 months. A filing system that had processed the complaints those sailors submitted and placed them in a queue with no scheduled review date. One of the 4 cases was Seaman First Class A, Whitmore, who had filed her complaint 11 weeks before Calloway walked into that gymnasium. The first case was a sailor who had been evaluated out of a program she had earned a slot in 4 years earlier, based on numbers that did not match her service record. She had been transferred to a different team. She had been deployed in a role that did not match her capability. She had not come home. Her name was Dana Whitmore. Harwick was not court-martialed. The legal calculus of what had been done was not in the end sufficient for that particular mechanism. The evaluations had been signed under his authority through systems that granted senior training officers the discretionary latitude considered standard for operational function. It was not in the precise and narrow legal sense fraud, in the form the institution's formal mechanisms were fully designed to address. This finding, which the Inspector General's report would note with the careful language of documents intended to be read for decades, was itself a finding of significance. What happened to Harrick was something the military has always been better at than civilian institutions the informal sanction. The reassignment that is technically a lateral move and functionally a conclusion. The posting that places a person in a role where they can no longer cause the specific kind of harm they have been causing, surrounded by people who know exactly what the posting means. He was gone from Coronado within 72 hours. His office was empty by the end of the week. The photograph of his father, which had hung behind his desk at a slight angle for years, was taken down. It was packed in the same box as everything else. Whether he kept it or what he did with it after is not something this account can reach. What is known is that he carried it out of that office himself in his own hands, and that the box was closed when he did. Stannard returned to the gymnasium at 10:47. He had been in 3 meetings since leaving the base commander's office. He had signed 2 documents and initiated 4 administrative reviews. He had made 2 phone calls to people whose names and titles do not appear in the public record. He had done all of this with the methodical efficiency of someone who has spent 30 years understanding that the work after the event is as important as the event itself, usually less visible and always harder. He walked into the gymnasium and found Calloway where he expected to find her. She was on the mat, not in a chair this time, sitting cross-legged on the rubber surface with the clipboard across her knee writing. She finished the line she was on before she looked up. Then she set the pen down and came to her feet in one smooth motion. Stannard crossed the floor and stood in front of her. He said, "It is done." She waited for the rest. He said, "The audit is initiated. 4 cases under active review. The IG's office will have everything they need by close of business." She nodded once. He said the Whitmore complaint will be addressed. Both of them. Something in her face moved in the way that still water moves when something has disturbed it below the surface, not visible in any single element, but present in the whole. It was the movement of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a longest time and has just been told they can set it down, but who has been carrying it long enough that the setting down is not a relief so much as a rearrangement. The weight does not disappear. It redistributes. It becomes part of the posture rather than the burden. She said, "Good." One word, clean as a line drawn with intention. Stannard looked at her. He had reached 57 by learning a small number of things with great certainty, and one of them was this: there are moments when the institution requires a gesture that exists below the level of paperwork and policy and official proceedings. A language the institution originally invented for exactly this purpose. For the formal public acknowledgement that something true has been witnessed and cannot be unseen. He came to attention, not a gradual straightening, the full, precise, deliberate position, every element correct, chin level, shoulder squared, weight even. He raised his hand. The salute was sharp and held and completely still. It was not theatrical. That is the thing about it that the people who heard the story afterward found difficult to convey. There was no drama in the gesture itself, no flourish, no visible emotion. It was simply a salute executed with the flawless precision of a man who has rendered this honor thousands of times and knows exactly what it costs and exactly what it means, which is precisely why it said everything it needed to say. Calloway rose to attention in the same motion she used for everything smooth and without ceremony. She returned the salute. She said, "Sir." The gymnasium was quiet. The light came through the high windows at the angle it comes through at that hour in September. In that part of California, falling across the worn blue mat and the 2 figures standing on it and the folding chair in the corner with the clipboard and the pen. Stannard lowered his hand. He said, "You will have your report filed by when?" She said, "End of day." He nodded. He said without particular emphasis, the way a person says something they mean, "The institution failed Dana Whitmore." He paused. "It should not have taken what happened this morning to begin correcting that. I am sorry that it did." She looked at him for a moment, not with surprise, with the careful attention of someone receiving something offered genuinely and deciding how to receive it correctly. She said, "Then make sure it does not take something like this next time." He held her gaze. He said, "That is the plan." He turned and walked back toward the gymnasium door. He did not look back. The door opened and closed. Calloway stood on the mat for a moment in the empty room. Then she sat back down. She picked up the pen. She finished the report. She filed the completed documentation at 15:34 that afternoon. 47 pages typed except for her signature. She left 2 copies with the administrative officer and retained 1 for the Inspector General's office per standard protocol. She returned her base access credentials at 15:47. She handed in the temporary quarters key at 15:53. At 16:01, she walked across the north side of the training complex toward the gymnasium. She had her duffel bag over one shoulder. She traveled the way people travel when they have spent years learning that everything they actually need fits in one bag and that anything that does not fit is negotiable. She pushed open the gymnasium door. The room was empty. The mat was still. The folding chair was still in the corner, where it had been all morning. The lights were on the automated evening setting slightly dimmer than the operational setting, giving the space a quality of suspension, as if the room itself was between things. She walked to the center of the mat. She stood there. She looked at the worn place in the middle, the smooth oval where 10,000 training hours had compressed the rubber down to something denser than the edges. She looked at the specific point where Harwick had gone down. The mat held nothing. It gave nothing back. She reached into the outer pocket of her duffel and took out a folded piece of paper, half a sheet folded twice. She had written it at the administrative office desk after submitting the report using the same pen she had used for everything else that day. She crouched and placed it on the mat at the center, at the worn smooth place. She straightened. She looked at the folded paper for a moment. Then she picked up her duffel and walked toward the gymnasium door. She was 2 steps from it when a voice said, "Specialist Calloway." She stopped. Seaman Garrett Finch was sitting on the bench along the wall near the equipment lockers. He had come in to return a training item to the cage and had sat down and had not gotten back up. He was 19 years old and he did not yet have the vocabulary for the kind of waiting that is not waiting for anything specific, but is simply the need to be in a place where something happened, because the place feels like the right place to be while the thing is still completing itself. He looked at the folded paper on the mat. Calloway turned. She looked at him. He said, "I was not trying to eavesdrop." She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then there was a woman in the corridor earlier, Whitmore. She said her name was Whitmore. Calloway said, "I know." He said, "She is the sister." It was not a question. He had put it together in the corridor, standing next to her, looking at the closed gymnasium door. Calloway said yes. He said she did not know about any of it. She was just checking in for her transfer. She had no idea what was happening in that room. Calloway said no. She did not know. Finch looked at the paper on the mat. He said, "Is that for the program? For the module they said they are going to develop?" She said no. He waited. She said, "It is a technique diagram, the movement sequence from this morning, written out so it does not get lost." He said, "They are going to name it after you." I already heard people talking in the corridor. "The Calloway counter," someone said. She looked at him directly. She said, "Ask them not to." He said, "I do not think I have the rank to ask anyone anything." She said, "You will have the rank eventually, when you do ask them. The technique is not mine. I learned it from someone who would have been better at it than me if she had been given the time to keep developing it." She paused. "If it needs a name, give it hers." He said, "What was her name?" She said, "Whitmore." She said it the way you say a name that belongs to a person who is no longer present, but who is not for that reason absent. Not a eulogy, not a performance. The true and accurate naming of something that deserved to be named correctly. Finch nodded slowly. He said, "I will remember that." She looked at him with those flat gray eyes, and whatever she saw there satisfied whatever she was measuring, because she nodded once the small, precise movement she used for things she considered settled. She turned toward the door. She stopped with her hand on it. She did not turn back. She said, "The technique is leverage. Learn it correctly. But what makes it work when it actually matters is knowing where a person's balance is and understanding that everyone has a place where they are less stable than they appear." She paused. "That is not a combat skill. That is a life skill. Dana understood it before I did. She just did not get enough time to prove it to the room." She pushed the door open. She said without turning, "Make the room see it." That is all. She was gone. The door swung back on its hinge and settled into its frame. Finch sat on the bench in the empty gymnasium for a long time after. He looked at the folded paper on the mat. He did not go pick it up. It was not his to open. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to a moment still completing itself that needs to finish on its own terms. Eventually he got up. He returned the training item to the cage. He turned off the gymnasium lights when he left. The paper sat in the dark on the center of the mat. On it, in the same even unhurried hand that had filled out the administrative forms and written 47 pages of evaluation findings and drawn a precise diagram of a technique that 2 seconds of its execution had already burned into the memory of 43 sailors, were 2 words: for Dana. The windowless room in Washington was the same as it had always been. The fluorescent light, the gray table, the folder. The man in the charcoal suit sat across from Calloway with the folder open in front of him and his hands flat on the table. He was at the part of the interview he had been working toward since the session began, the part where the documentation had been reviewed and the timeline established, and the one remaining question was the one the documentation could not answer. He said the report covers the procedural findings thoroughly, the evaluation discrepancies, the complaint processing failures, the corrective recommendations. He paused. He said what it does not address is the day itself, the gymnasium. He looked at her. You had been there 4 days. The documentation was substantially complete before that morning. What I am asking is whether the incident was anticipated, whether what happened in the gymnasium was part of the methodology. She said the incident was not planned. He said, but it was not a surprise. She said, I had watched in 6 training sessions. I had reviewed 14 months of administrative records. I had a complete picture of the program's conduct. He said, so you knew what Harwick was? She said, I knew what the records showed. Records and people are different things. He said, and what did the man show you? She was quiet for a moment. She said, a person who had confused the story he told about himself with the thing he actually was. She paused. It is not an unusual condition. It is just a more consequential version of something most people do to some degree. He wrote something in the margin. He said, and after the incident, the file reading the salute from Stannard. You had to know what that would mean for your ability to maintain a low profile. She said the assignment was already complete. He said the report had not been filed yet. She said the information was gathered. Filing is administrative. He looked at her for the kind of long moment that belongs to people who ask questions for a living and have learned to read the space between what a person says and what the saying of it costs them. He said, is there anything else you want this record to reflect? She was quiet. Then she said, I want it reflected that Seaman A. Whitmore filed her complaint in good faith through the correct channels and waited 11 weeks with no response. She paused. That should be in the record because it is the most important fact in the entire document. Everything else follows from that, he wrote. He said, and Dana Whitmore. The fluorescent light hummed. Calloway said Dana Whitmore was a Tier 1 level operator who was removed from the program that would have placed her in the assignment she was trained for based on an evaluation that did not reflect her actual performance. She was subsequently assigned to an operational environment with a reduced support structure. She was killed in 2017. She said it with the same measured precision she had used for everything else. But the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It had a weight that the other silences had not carried, because the words were the most accurate words in the room. And accuracy, when applied to something this specific and this irreversible, has a gravity that is different from any other kind. The man in the charcoal suit closed his folder. He said, thank you, Specialist Calloway. She said, sir. She rose from the chair. She picked up the single item she had brought into the room, a water bottle, and she walked to the door and she opened it and she was gone. The man sat in the empty room for a moment. He opened the folder again and looked at the last thing he had written in the margin. He closed it. He picked it up and turned off the light. Coda the Whitmore, marked 6 months later. Naval Amphibious, Base Coronado, March 2020. The gymnasium had been repainted. Not entirely. The floor and the equipment and the high windows were the same, but the walls were 2 shades lighter and the ventilation system had been replaced with something quieter and the mat was new, a different density of rubber that held its shape better under the weight of daily training. The worn oval in the center from 10,000 hours of practice was gone. Almost. Near the center of the new mat, slightly left of middle, there was a mark. Someone had applied it with a permanent marker. A small, clean, 5-pointed star drawn with care, but without the self-consciousness of a person making a monument. Drawn the way someone draws something they want to stay. Nobody who was asked about it admitted to putting it there. This is consistent with how significant things are often placed in institutional spaces. Anonymously at a time when no one is officially watching, by a person who understood that the mark needed to exist but that the mark was not about them. On the mat around that star, 14 new sailors stood in a formation that was slightly uncertain at the edges, the posture of people who are still learning the physical language of the institution they have just joined. They ranged in age from 19 to 24. They had come from different states and different circumstances and different reasons that they would spend their careers learning to articulate and re-articulate as those reasons deepened and changed. They waited. At the front of the mat, a young man in an assistant instructor's uniform looked out at them with the expression of someone who is 20 years old and has been given a responsibility larger than his rank and is trying to be equal to it through sincerity rather than performance. Seaman Garrett Finch had been assigned as a training assistant 6 weeks earlier, a provisional role in administrative accommodation for a sailor who had shown in his first months of posting the quality of attention that experienced chiefs find useful in controlled doses. He had not sought the role. He had been recommended by a chief who had noticed during 3 separate training sessions that Finch watched instructors the way people watch things they are trying to understand rather than things they are simply trying to comply with. He looked at the 14 sailors. He looked at the mark on the mat. He walked to it and stood beside it. He said, "Before we start, there is something about this room you should know." His voice was steady, slightly quiet. He had learned from watching the people he respected that volume is not authority, that the sentence requiring you to raise your voice is usually a sentence that could be restructured. He said 6 months ago, something happened in this gymnasium that changed how we run this program, changed some of what we teach, how we teach it, and I believe why we teach it. He paused. He said, "There was a woman who came through here as part of an evaluation process. She sat in the corner in a folding chair and filled out paperwork, and nobody paid her any particular attention. Average height, average build. She had been in the service for about 10 years. He looked at the mark. He said a senior officer decided publicly in front of a room full of people that she was not qualified to be here based on how she looked. He decided that out loud, and then he decided to prove it." He paused. He said, "He was wrong. He was wrong in a way that this gym has not forgotten. He was wrong in a way that this gym should not forget." One of the new sailors, a young woman in the third row, looked at the star on the mat. She looked back at Finch. He said, "The technique that woman used that day is now part of the training curriculum. Module 7B. Some people call it the Callaway sequence after the specialist who executed it." He looked at the star. He said, "But that is not the name on the mark." The room was quiet. That particular quality of quiet that belongs to people who have just understood that they are about to receive information that will matter to them for a long time. He said the woman who used that technique learned it from someone else, someone who should have learned it in this program. Someone who was evaluated out of a slot she had earned because someone with authority decided the numbers on a form mattered more than the person those numbers were supposed to represent. He said that woman was transferred to a different team. She was deployed in a role that did not match what she was capable of. She did not come home. He said her name was Dana Whitmore. He said it the way Callaway had said it in a windowless room in Washington 6 months before. Not as a eulogy, as an accurate naming. The naming of something that deserved to be named correctly and to have that correctness witnessed. He said the mark on this mat is called the Whitmore mark. When you stand on it, that is the name you are standing on. Not a technique, not a moment. A person who should have been here and was not because a system failed her, and the failure was not corrected until someone came from the outside and stood in the center of this room and made it impossible to look away. He looked at the 14 sailors. He said, "This program is going to teach you leverage and force and the geometry of what happens when bodies are in conflict. That is the curriculum, and it is important, and you should learn it with everything you have." He paused. He said, "The thing it cannot teach you directly is the thing underneath all of that. The part that decides whether the technique works when it actually matters. That part is harder, and it does not have a module number. It is just this. Know what you are doing it for. Know the name you are standing on. And do not let anything make you forget it." He looked at the mark one more time. Then he looked at the formation. He said, "All right, let us get started." The young woman in the third row looked at the mark for a moment before she moved. The other sailors were already responding, stepping into position, redistributing across the mat. She stood still for one more second, looking at the star drawn in black on the rubber surface. The small, careful, anonymous mark that someone had placed there to say that a person had stood here and been seen, and that another person had stood here and not been seen, and that both of those things were true and neither could be taken back, and that the distance between them was the reason the room was in session. She stepped onto it. She set her weight evenly across both feet. She looked up. That gymnasium still exists. The mark is still there, its edges softened from foot traffic, but its shape indexed the way the shapes of significant things tend to remain intact when they are placed with care on surfaces that receive them correctly. Nora Calloway is somewhere. The record of where is not available to this account, which is how the record is supposed to be. She is doing work that does not appear in the public domain and does not require a name attached to it. She did not know when she walked out of that gymnasium in September that they would draw a mark on the mat. She does not know about the name they gave it. She is unlikely to know now. This is not a loss to her. She did not require the mark. She did not require the story. She required that the report be accurate and complete, and that the names in it be correctly attributed, and that the woman whose complaint had waited 11 weeks in an unreviewed queue received the response she was owed. Those things happened. The rest is institutional memory. And institutional memory is not built for the people it commemorates. It is built for the people who come after. For the young woman in the third row setting her weight on the Whitmore mark for the first time. For the sailor 2 years from now who will hear the story secondhand and get half the details wrong, but will understand at the level that matters what it is saying. For the officer who will hear Brett Harwick's name used quietly and without sentiment as a description of a category of error, and who will spend the following year making a series of small decisions differently than he might have otherwise. There is a question this story does not answer. It does not answer it because it cannot. And because the right response to an unanswerable question is to place it where people can sit with it rather than to manufacture a resolution that makes the sitting unnecessary. The question is this: how many Dana Whitmores were there before Coronado? Not in that program. In all the programs. In all the rooms where a person with authority over a form made a decision about what the numbers should say. In all the filing systems where a complaint arrived and was logged and placed in a queue that had no scheduled review date. In all the hallways where someone with a story the institution needed decided it would be easier if that story remained untold. How many of them are still waiting? The gymnasium holds that question. The mark on the mat holds that question. Every sailor who has stood on it has inherited that question, whether they knew it or not. That is what it means to stand on a name. Not ceremony, not symbolism. The actual practical ongoing responsibility of knowing what was given so that the ground you are standing on exists and deciding every day that you are going to be worth it. Nora Calloway understood that. She had understood it since 2017. She carried it the way people who carry things like that carry them. Quietly, completely, without requiring anyone to see the weight. Because the carrying is not for an audience, it is for the person whose name is on the mark. It is for the work that still needs doing. It always has been. And if you have served, or if you know someone who has, I would like to hear about them in the comments. Not the stories that made the news, the ones that did not. The ones carried quietly by people the room decided not to see until something made it impossible to look away. Those are the stories that matter. Those are the ones worth remembering.